record. All right. Welcome everybody. If other people join, that is great. Otherwise, I will post this as I did the last one. Before I started the recording, Emily asked a great question. She asked if you could only have the 4 studies or if you should have additional sources as well. And the answer is you should absolutely have additional resources as well. Great places for those are if you are defining things like trauma or resilience, or like for Corey, physical activity, if you feel like that needed a definition of what constitutes that. Those are great things to include some sources in the background information. It would be a very lean paper if you only had 5 sources, because a lot of the stuff that we're using, the textbooks and stuff, could be in there as definitions or like, what are traumatic events? What is resilience? What are ACEs? Those are things that you should use sources from previous in the program to build out. If your studies have definitions, you can absolutely use that, and that's fine. But don't feel like you need to find studies that have those definitions. You can use previous sources. You find the sharing moved on my Zoom here. Of course, there it is. All right. Now, I wanted to share the rubric quick, as I was actually just starting to grade the first paper that's been turned in. And I wanted to point out that the review and synthesis of the sources is more points than the actual sources. So it's more important that you break them down in that narrative component than that you describe them. It's still important to describe them and say, number of participants, type of study, that it is scholarly and peer reviewed. You don't necessarily need to call that out. Your citation should kind of show that that is the case. 5 of you have sent in rough drafts, and every single one of you has done a good job of incorporating this portion of it into the review and synthesis. So my recommendation for those of you who are still maybe worried about that is the first time you talk about a study and maybe have a quote or something from that study, the next sentence should then be explaining the study. So I have the child's brain is incapable of transferring control from the brainstem to the higher complex thinking regions, blah, 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 quotation. And then the next sentence would be, this study was conducted on 40 middle school students in a suburban area. They did XYZ for quantitative or qualitative. That way you've covered both points of it, and you're really just incorporating that this is what the study was and possibly the weaknesses of it there. It also works pretty well to pull out those limitations for all of the studies. Corey, if you're willing to talk about that at all, you have a great example of that in your rough draft that you sent me, of having all the limitations pulled out to the end. I don't know if your sound is working. But otherwise, as with the last one, we are now just open floor for questions. Sorry, Corey. I can talk about it real briefly too. So Corey is writing about physical activity and how that helps build resilience and kind of heal trauma. And he does a great job throughout of citing his sources and then breaking down the study. And then one of his last paragraphs is limitations of research, where he talks about the limitations of the various studies as well as his own research. That is a great way to do it. It also works to do the limitations throughout as you talk about the studies, and then talk about the limitations of your own research and options for future research at the end. Those are both very viable options. Jessica or Morgan, do either of you have questions?
I don't. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think I'm okay for now too. Thank you.
All right.
I
One
just
theme. Go ahead, Emily.
I have a clarifying question based on what you just said,
Yep.
with the limitations. When
Yep.
you say our own research, like Corey shared the limitations of the studies that he found and his own research, is that like
Like
our research process or
it could be that. So, for example, I only looked at 5 studies. I know there are more. Like that's a limitation of your research, or
okay.
I was very specifically interested in this topic in this specific area, and there's not a lot of research in it, so that's a limitation of your research.
Okay.
Or the flip side of that, I was interested in this topic and there is a ton of research, so I was unable to cover it all.
Okay.
Corey, did your sound work now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Awesome. Yeah, so the only question I really have is so going forward, I
Mhm.
know in the syllabus and some of the other uh the other descriptions of this assignment lay out that this is gonna like direct us towards our capstone.
Yep.
So where are we going from here with this information?
Building it out farther.
Okay.
So if
So
you
in
stick with the same topic, from the syllabus that I found from a couple go arounds ago of 590, you're building out from 5 to 15.
okay.
So if you still want to work on the same topic, you absolutely can, and you can build off of what you've already written.
Okay. And within that, like you can expand it out into different avenues. Like instead of like for my case, could I instead of talking specifically about the brain, talking about like how it's like can be used to I don't know, for example, some kids come into the gym just to get their energy out
Yep,
and like describe
absolutely.
that process.
That would be a great subsection.
Okay.
Yep. When you have kind of like your big overarching topic, but there are subsections like that, those make great subheadings.
Okay.
Um, they're not necessarily going to be a paper of their own, but they could also be a subsection and then discussed in ideas for future research. Would be to focus
Okay.
on that.
Sure. That makes
Yep.
sense. That because like at first I was worried that my topic was too narrow, like I could only explore it in one way, but that helps knowing that we can explore it in other ways like that.
Mhm. As long as you draw the connection to how your big overarching topic is connected to those subthemes, you'll be fine.
Perfect. That's kind of the only question I had.
Awesome. One thing I noticed from everybody's who's already made their initial response remarks this week was just the feeling of nervousness and not feeling like you know what you're doing. And I want everybody to know that that doesn't go away. Even if you go on and you go into a doctoral program and you're writing a dissertation, I did not feel comfortable that I knew what I was doing until after I defended my dissertation and they came back and approved it. So I spent 9 months to a year writing a paper and preparing a presentation and not feeling comfortable that I knew what I was doing. So know that that isn't abnormal. That is kind of what doing research feels like, even up until and after you get a dissertation done. So don't feel like you're inferior or don't know what you're doing. That is doing research. We're all learning all the time, and it's not something that comes naturally to a lot of people.
So I think I messaged you about this before. So when I'm researching my different topics,
Mhm.
um, I'm doing how language and culture benefit Native students.
Absolutely.
And so the things I'm coming up with are the indigenous peoples in Australia, New Zealand.
Yep.
You have the First Nations in Canada.
Mhm.
And then you have different tribes throughout the US. So should I focus on using like one certain population?
No. I would recommend using at least one study that is from the US. But if you, as the researcher, feel that those other groups are valid to your research, include them. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
Yep.
If you feel like their historical background, traumas, etc., are relevant, I would include them. I think that is an excellent thing specifically for your topic to look at the indigenous groups in Australia and Canada as well. And I'm glad that you were able to find research on those groups because that is going to be awesome to read.
Another quick question. I was wondering if, like, for example, there's specific examples I can pull from using my students.
Mhm.
Uh I know you spoke about this in the last video. So if we use an example like that, we just need to cite ourselves. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Of course, I don't have my AP manual next to me, but I believe there is a way to cite yourself as a source,
Okay.
as like a first person experience or like an interview with yourself type of thing.
Sure.
Try not to use I. So like in this researcher's own practice, this occurred type
Okay.
of thing. If you actually interviewed a student, there is a way to cite that or a colleague. Students are more complicated because there should be releases with parents, but if you interview a colleague to use that kind of firsthand experience, there is a way to cite that in the APA manual.
Okay. Because that was something I might do actually is interview some of the the grade level teachers who experience kids when they don't have gym class and how they react to that. So that would be a good avenue to attack.
Yeah. I wouldn't count that as, that can't count as a peer-reviewed study, but it is a great additional source. Like I mentioned, Emily asking about as where that'll build out your research a lot, having some of that stuff intermixed with the
Okay.
peer-reviewed studies.
Perfect.
Kind of going back to what you were talking about with like the subheadings and the
Mhm.
subtopics. So is it okay if like I have two peer-reviewed sources that fit like into one subtopic and then like three that go into another, or do all?
Absolutely.
Okay, so it's not like all five have to kind of
No,
fit into each. It's like
absolutely not.
it's okay to break it up like that.
I would be super impressed if you were able to fit them all into one, and then I'd be worried about any of your other subheadings.
Okay, perfect.
I have given feedback already that there was a couple paragraphs that need to be built out more in somebody's rough draft and that didn't have sources at all. And if you have a paragraph that doesn't have sources, it probably doesn't belong in a literature review.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
That doesn't mean it has to have a peer-reviewed source, but it should have a
Right.
source of some kind.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's also fine if you have paragraphs or sub-themes that only have one source. That's fine.
Okay, just as long as in our literature review, we have the five, like
The
that.
5 minimum
Yeah.
peer-reviewed studies that are identified as qualitative, quantitative, or mixed study.
Okay,
Mixed
perfect.
methods, sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And that is one of the things that like on the ones that I'm reviewing right now, I'm not counting the studies. I'm just looking at the formatting. Does this flow? Does it look like you got the right idea? When I do your actual grading for the final one, I do have to count the studies to make sure you actually have 5 that you've identified as these are my 5 peer-reviewed studies. You don't need to say them like that, but I should be able to identify them in your paper. Because those are the ones where you're going to say this was a quantitative study, a qualitative study, or they had so many students in middle school and gave them a survey type of thing. That's how I know that that's one of the 5 studies that counts towards the requirement of the syllabus. I'm going to pause the recording until somebody has another question. The 4 of you that are here don't feel like you need to hang out. I don't have anything more planned to talk about. If there are more questions, I will turn the recording back on. Thank you guys for being here and giving up some of your time this Wednesday evening, and I hope you continue to be successful on your lit reviews.